Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Golby, and welcome to the first video in the series that I'm going to be calling the Photography Basics, or the Basics of Photography. And this video is going to be a little bit longer than the other ones in the series because I do want to give you a bit of an introduction as to why I decided to make this series and what I hope that you guys will get from it. So let's get going. Now, a while back I did a video introducing the way that I approach composition, and in that video I asked if anybody would be interested in a series on composition and the way that I like to approach it. And the response was really positive, but I've struggled with the considerations that I work through and how to put those into words. And so it was actually a lot harder for me than I had expected when I threw that idea out there. So as I was considering the way to approach that, I kept going back to the simple thought of, well, if you want to do this, then you need to know this, and if you want to do this, then you need to know this. And so it kind of kept spiraling like that ever since, and so I never really managed to actually get started on it. So instead of trying to approach a simple topic like composition, I've decided to start a series of videos basically from the beginning and talk about the basics of photography as I see them. So hopefully you can start to understand my approach to photography as a whole. So this series will cover the sorts of topics, like exposure triangle and RAW versus JPEG and what sort of lenses you need for certain subjects. And, they'll be filled with opinions and sort of glints of knowledge that I've gained over my 20+ years of taking photographs and also my 10+ years as a working professional. So hopefully they'll be interesting and informative, but more than that, I hope that they'll spark some sort of desire in you to get out there and, make photographs in new ways or approach photography a little bit differently. So these videos aren't going to be super technical. I don't pretend to understand the science of optics or the engineering that goes into a modern camera. I'm a photographer, I'm not a lens designer, I'm not a camera engineer. But I do remember when I first started photography, I picked up my very first SLR, a Nikon D50, and trying to come to grips with all this stuff, I was completely mystified. So there's a certain level of understanding that's required, and then beyond that, I think it's all about figuring out how you can bend these tools, bend these concepts to your will, and that's what this series is about. So the other thing that I want to do is I want to title this series in a little bit of a provocative manner. Basically the questions that I asked myself when I started, in photography. And what the heck is a portrait lens? And what shutter speed should I use? And what is the best aperture? And all of these things that I had in my head that I've come to understand now, but I hope that the way that I've come to understand them will be helpful to others, and so I'm going to try and express those here. And the most important takeaway from all of these videos is that there really is no single answer. It's sort of a process and a method, and it's a little bit difficult to approach it that way, but hopefully it will be a little bit more helpful in the end and teach you guys a way to approach your photography. So, on to today's topic, aperture. What is the best aperture? So I'll start the video with a quick explanation of what the aperture is and how it works, and then we'll get into how it sort of affects your images and show a few examples of the way that I approach choosing my aperture value in my work. Now, all of these sections are timestamped, so if you already understand what the aperture is and how it affects your image, feel free to skip over that and get to the main talking point, but I will leave it in here for those of you who maybe don't understand exactly how it all works. So one final thing that I want to mention before we get into this topic is that the technical aspects that I'll talk about with regards to aperture may or may not be of importance to you and your work, and that's okay. We're just going to discuss what physically changes when you adjust that aperture value before we get into how to be creative with it. And it's good to know our tools so that we can exploit them and make images with them. Okay, aperture. So what is it and what does it do? Well, the word aperture means opening, or put more crudely, hole. It literally is the opening in the lens that gets larger or smaller and allows light to pass through to your sensor or film if you're still shooting film. Now, if you look down the barrel of a lens and change the aperture value, this is a little bit easier to see with a vintage lens that has a physical aperture control, but you should see a series of blades either coming together or moving apart to create a larger or a smaller opening. Sort of like the beginning of a James Bond film, only without the bullet at the end, so it's a little bit safer. Now, as the aperture gets larger, larger, more light is allowed to pass through, and as it gets smaller, less light is allowed to pass through, making your exposure brighter or darker. And in the end, that's really the primary function, and it's most of what we need to know as photographers. But the thing that probably confuses people the most in the beginning is the notation. Why on earth does f1.4 allow in more light than f8? The simple answer can be seen from the slash in between the f and the number. This is the division symbol that we see in mathematics. The f stands for focal length, and that number is something that you need to divide it by. So if we divide the focal length of the lens by the current aperture value, you'll actually get a smaller result from a larger aperture value. And that result is the diameter of the aperture inside the lens, and thus a smaller number will correlate to a smaller opening for light to pass through and less light on the sensor or the film. Okay, remember, we're not designing lenses here, we're using them. Now, you might have heard aperture values referred to as f-stops. Now, we can use the word stop in photography to describe an arbitrary amount of light. Now, each stop on a lens has a specific number assigned to it, such as f1.4, f2, f5.6, f8. Each one of those equates to doubling or halving the amount of light that the film or the sensor receives. So if I stop my lens down from f1.4 to f2, I'm halving the amount of light. Again, from f2 to f2.8, I'm halving the amount of light. And this continues as far as the lens will stop down. This matters not so much in and of itself, but when we start adding in the other variables. They all matter relative to each other. So in this video, we're going to do one simple example to demonstrate the importance of this relationship, and then we'll move on to the more interesting topics. So here I have a really good exposure at 1/250th of a second at f8. However, if I open up my aperture to f5.6, the image gets one stop brighter. In order to compensate for that, I can simply make my shutter speed faster by one stop, and we're back to the same exposure. That's provided the engineers have done their job well and everything is accurate within the camera. Okay, so surely restricting the light must have other effects on our images, and well, it does. And so as we stop down or close the aperture, the technical qualities of a lens typically improve, and the depth of field, that is how much is in focus from front to back, begins to increase. And so let's first consider those technical image qualities, and these are things like sharpness or chromatic aberration or chroma. And as we stop down on most lenses, we see a sharper image with more fine detail, less color fringing around high contrast edges. Small light sources such as stars or faraway street lights tend to render as pinpoints rather than splitting into these winged shapes due to chroma. We can see that here from this image taken with the Fujifilm XF 56mm f1.2. Now, as good as this lens is wide open, when we go from f1.2 to f2.8, we see a huge increase in detail and contrast, and we stop seeing those green and purple fringes around the edges of, things like the hairs in the high contrast scene. So if stopping down like this improves your images, shouldn't you just set your lens to f16 and shoot everything like that? Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple, and these technical characteristics tend to improve to a point and then drop off again, much like a bell curve. So then there's also that consideration of depth of field and the smaller amount of light that's hitting your sensor to consider. So let's look at that bell curve first. Most lenses perform technically best around the middle of their aperture range, so you'll generally find that if a lens has something like a range from f1.4 all the way to f22, then it probably performs best technically around about f5.6 all the way out to f11. And so if what you want from your lens is to get the most sharpness, the least chromatic aberration, basically the best technical image quality that you can zoom in and poke around at, then using those aperture values will give you the results you want. But if what you want is to creatively use a lens and maybe start to exploit its characteristics, then you'll want to understand how that particular lens works. So let's first take a look at depth of field, and then we'll get into a little bit of that. Now, depth of field is quite simple. The further you stop down, the more of your scene will be in focus from front to back. So with all things being equal, if I have a photograph at f16, it will have more depth of field than if I have a photograph at f2. Now, the distance between the camera and the subject also has a huge effect on depth of field, but we'll get into that later. Now, it pays to remember that every change you make in photography technically comes with consequences. So if you stop down from f1.4 to 5.6 because you want a sharper image, you'll also get deeper depth of field and less light hitting your sensor. But if you continue to work at, say, f1.4 because you need the light, you might find that you miss focus from time to time because of that narrow depth of field, or you have a little bit more chromatic aberration in your images, and that becomes an issue. So as you can see, there are a few changes that begin to happen when you vary your aperture value. But what I want you to remember here is that when it comes to small differences in depth of field, sharpness, vignettes, color fringing, it's always good to sort of temper what you think is very important with one of my favorite quotes from a photographer by the name of David Duchemin from his book, The Soul of the Camera. Let's take a look at that. All right, almost out of coffee. So with all of this in mind, here is my basic process for selecting my aperture values for my photography. Now, it's very important to remember that image making is a personal process, and these considerations are just my own. I'm not a particularly technical photographer, so my first consideration always begins with the subject. Now, for me, I'm always going to try to get a visually interesting image that showcases the subject, or, a solid moment over any form of technical perfection. So the very first thing that I consider when I'm going to choose any of the settings at all on my camera is, what do I want you to look at, and how can I essentially force you to look at what I want you to look at in my composition? So a simple example of this might be a person sitting for a portrait. Now, there are a few different ways that I can make them stand off the background and force you to look at them, and one of those might be, choosing colors in the background that set their face or their clothing apart from the background, or I might use light to make them brighter or higher contrast than anything else in the scene. Or I might use depth of field. Now, since we're talking about aperture today, let's talk about depth of field. Now, this can be a great tool when you're on location and the background seems maybe a little bit distracting. So by blurring that background using a shallow depth of field, you can basically force, or at least strongly encourage, the people who are viewing your subject to look at your chosen subject. And basically this is that human eyes like to look at areas of an image that have strong detail rather than not having any detail at all. The human eye likes to basically explore an image and find things to look at. Now, the bokeh lovers of the world may disagree with me on this. They might think the bokeh is the most important thing, but typically our eyes look for things where they can explore some detail. So let's look at an extremely exciting photograph of a small plant in the forest as an example. In the first image, I used f1.4 to isolate those leaves using depth of field. And this takes your eyes straight to them, or at least it will take you from that bright light in the background from the setting sun to the leaves. Now, there's really nothing else for you to look at in this frame. But if I shoot the same scene at f11, we get a very different image. While I might want you to look at the leaves of the plant in the foreground, chances are you're going to start with that giant sun star and the bright sun in the background and have trouble settling on those leaves because of all the other detail that's now visible from stopping down and using a deep depth of field. A bit less of a lens test and a bit more of a real-world example of how to use this would be to include foreground elements and sort of allow them to blur with a shallow depth of field. Now, in this example, the reeds in the foreground are lit by the setting sun and give an abstract sense of depth to the image. We know there is something there, but we're not really sure what it is, and it helps to break up the sort of rigid nature of the bridges in the background, and also that, those bridges are in sharp focus, so we're drawn to those first and we can sort of start to explore the details, and those reeds just give us a sense of time of day and a little bit more depth to the image. So it's very easy to get sucked into that trap of thinking, well, I spent so much on this fast lens, it opens all the way up to f1.2, and when I do that, people look exactly at what I want them to look at, and I get this beautiful shallow depth of field, and so why don't I just put a piece of tape on that lens and never let it open up beyond that? And it's very easy to get sucked into that, and there are definitely a lot of Instagram accounts out there that will convince you that yes, that's definitely a valid way to work, and it certainly is. Having a young lady holding some fairy lights out and getting some beautiful bokeh balls produces a nice image, but if you continue to work only in that way, it can actually detract from a lot of different compositions that you might be able to make and being able to inject a little bit of extra meaning into your photos. So considering, where I want detail and how I want to basically add to the subject is another thing that I like to do. Remember that human eyes like to explore detail in image, and so, in a landscape image, I want to consider how important are those rocks in the foreground, how much detail, how much texture do I want you to be able to see in those. In an environmental portrait, I want to be able to decide how much of that detail in the background or the foreground should be blurry or not so blurry. How much do I want you to look at that and gain some sort of insight from? So here's an example of a portrait I made of a konjac elder in northeast India. In this first image, I photographed him at f8 on the Fujifilm GF 110mm lens, and at this distance and this aperture, that gave me enough depth of field to get good detail in his face, his chest, his accessories, and basically make a good representation of this man and what he looks like. But in the second frame, I took the opportunity to get in a little bit closer and open up my aperture to f2 for a really, really shallow depth of field. And this allows me to focus your attention on the depth of his gaze rather than everything else that's in the scene. And it's an image that represents a little bit better what it felt like to be in his presence rather than what I saw. Now, there's no right or wrong here, and I love both images. They tell a different story and serve a different purpose. But what I would love to hear from you guys in the comments is, do you have a personal preference between the two? Does one express this man a little bit better to you? In this image, I chose to use the XF 35mm wide open at f1.4. Now, the shallow depth of field is not as pronounced as it is in the portrait we just saw, but it does draw your attention to the subject and sort of hold it there. If I'd chosen to stop down and achieve a deeper depth of field here, your eyes would likely be drawn to the details in the palace gate or the sky behind. And so a more subtle use of depth of field can really help to sort of focus the viewer while still offering those sort of supporting details in the background there. So we don't always have to go to the extreme in either direction. So as a final example of this idea, let's consider a more prominent foreground. Now, here the persimmon tree gives a clue as to the season this was photographed in, and also helps to conceal the more complex parts of the architecture in the background there. I'd like to ask, would this image still work if I'd stopped down to f8 and showed, detail in the leaves and the persimmons? Or would a lot of detail be something that detracted from this image? Or maybe if I stopped all the way out to f1.4 and just turned the foreground into a blurry swatch of color, what effect would that have had? So another consideration that I have is a bit more of a technical one. It's to whether I even have enough light to work with my desired aperture. So remember that as we stop down, we need more light, and so we need a slower shutter speed or a higher ISO value to basically compensate for that reduction in light hitting the sensor. For example, if I'm working in a candlelit room shooting a corporate dinner, as much as I might want to stop down to f5.6 and get a few different people's faces in focus with great sharpness and a good depth of field, the result might be a shutter speed that would blur my subjects, such as 1/8 of a second, or it might even be an astronomical ISO like 100,000 or something, which my Fujifilm cameras can't even do. So sometimes aperture choice is purely a practical decision to balance other considerations. Now, at times like these, I'll first look at how high I'm willing to set my ISO and how slow I'm willing to let my shutter speed get. So, for example, with the X-T4, I don't typically like to work with, extremely high ISO values for portraits, as I start to get sort of a reduction in that color fidelity and an increase in noise. And so this can quickly deteriorate my images. And so unless I have to, I'm going to try to work as close to my base ISO of 160 as I can, and so that's my first consideration. Now, in the case of a portrait, there'll typically be a little bit of movement of myself or movement of my subject as well, so the IBIS in the camera can't really help with that, and so I'll need to keep my shutter speed quite high as well to be able to get a sharp image. So if I have the choice between these values, I'm most likely going to opt for the f2 set for most situations to take, to take the hit in depth of field, because I want to be able to get a sharp and color accurate image of my subject. But I'll definitely make trade-offs in these if I really have to, just to be able to get an image. On the flip side, sometimes when the light is quite low, I might actually want a longer shutter speed to blur motion, and in this case I'll often work with a tripod, stop the aperture down as far as I need to be able to get the shutter speed that I want. But I'm always a bit careful to avoid unwanted deterioration of the image from stopping down too far. Now, an example of this might be, the Samyang 12mm f2. I do have access to f22 on that lens, and I could stop down that far to get a really long shutter speed, and say the blue hour or something like that. But I know from experience that the 12mm gets very, very soft, doesn't render much detail at all at that aperture, so I wouldn't want to stop down that far. And so I'd rather stop down to f8 or f11 and maybe use an ND filter on the lens to be able to get the shutter speed that I want, rather than having to stop down and basically be at the hands of that lens suffering a little bit when it stops down that far. Now, sometimes it's not all about the story I want to tell or the technical qualities or the elements that I want to focus on. Sometimes it's just fun to play with a specific rendering of a particular lens. And while not all lenses have unique renderings that are sort of instantly recognizable, certain lenses do, and that can be enough to sort of get my creative juices flowing and get me out just making some interesting images. And I think a good example of this would be the red rings that are produced by the Laowa 33mm f0.95 when it gets used wide open. Now, these appear when a bright light source is close to the frame or in the frame, and when you're working wide open. But the moment you knock that aperture ring anywhere towards f1, those effects disappear immediately. And for me, this can often be the primary reason that I'll take this lens out. It's not there because it's lightweight or easy to work with. It's there because when I have the right conditions, I can add a little spice to my images, and that's enough for me to shoot the lens wide open. Another lens that I like to work with in this way is the GF 110mm f2. Now, when used around f2 or f2.8 and in really, really close proximity to the subject, you get this sort of beautiful separation between in focus and out of focus, and dare I say it, it gives a bit of a three-dimensional feel to the images. But once you stop down to sort of f3.2, f4, all of that starts to disappear, and the image goes back to being a technically excellent, but a little bit more of a flat image. And so knowing this and having experimented with this, I can choose to play to the strengths of my particular lens and choose the aperture that I want to work with. But a simpler, maybe more accessible example of this might be the use of sun stars. So once you stop a lot of different lenses down, they start to produce these sun stars around bright light sources like the sun or street lights. And the Fujifilm X100V's lens is a really good example of this. Now, the sun stars that it creates aren't always the most defined in their shape, but they can add a little something to an otherwise maybe boring composition. Now, if I'd shot this scene at f2, it's likely the sun would have just been sort of a glowing ball above the buildings, but my choice of f8 allows it to create a bit of a starburst around it, and I feel like this gives a little more interest to the composition. I feel like the opposite would actually be true in this case, where a defined star shape around the sun would have maybe pulled your eyes away from the statues of Buddha and his pupils. Now, again, this goes back to what I want to achieve in the photo, what I want you to look at. Now, do I want you to appreciate the subject or the way it was photographed? In this case, I do want to draw your attention to the subject rather than my technique. So in summary, I typically consider what I want you to look at first, and then maybe whether I want you to explore other parts of the image, so my depth of field, and then I'll consider things like the special renderings that a lens has. Does it offer something that other lenses don't at a specific aperture? And then I might consider things like, do I need to stop down to get rid of any specific issues this lens has, or do I need a specific shutter speed or ISO? And so in the beginning, I ruined a lot of images by basically choosing the inappropriate aperture for the results that I wanted, and you won't get to see those. But this process became a whole lot more second nature, a bit more like muscle memory over time, and so I encourage you to persevere in trying to find the way that you like to work with these things. So this has been my biggest undertaking for YouTube so far, and I hope that you've enjoyed it, or at least learned a little something from it. And as I continue with these upcoming videos, they will get a little bit shorter. We won't have the introduction in there, but please do let me know if there are any topics that you would like me to cover, things that maybe you're confused about as I continue this series. So I want these videos to be not just for me sitting here in a chair talking to you, but for these to be as useful to you as they can be. So I've got a few topics in mind as we continue, things like lenses for a certain purpose, like what is the best portrait lens, or the rest of the exposure triangle, shutter speeds and ISOs, or what do I need to do in order to, use flash for the first time. Now, the one thing I won't really be doing is post-production, because honestly, I don't really enjoy it, and I'm not really good enough at it to warrant me trying to explain the things that I do. But I would really love to hear any other non-post-production related topics that you guys might want me to chat about. So I'm going to wrap this up here now and basically let you guys get back to your day. So if you made it this far in the video, thanks a lot for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.